Welcome back to another Lab tutorial. Today, we're going to be talking about dynamic range again. And specifically, the conversation is going to be focused on a tool called an expander. Probably one of the most highly misunderstood, overlooked, and underutilized plugins in most DAW's library of tools. And with good reason. A lot of people may not ever even need a tool like this in their projects or productions. But what we're here to do today is break down exactly what it is, how you can use it, and how you can misuse it as well. But what we're not going to do is bog down this whole thing with all of this peripheral discussion that usually gets caught up in conversations around expanders. Okay, and to do that, to do that successfully, what I really want to do is kind of back up a few steps and revisit something that the majority of you probably already understand pretty well, and that is the compressor. Okay, this is another dynamic range tool, a dynamics processing tool, and in fact, when you think of dynamic range, the first couple of tools that pop into most people's minds nowadays anyway, are compressors and limiters. And, you know, a limiter, in all fairness, is basically just a compressor, a brick wall compressor. So you're really only thinking of like one tool there. And maybe, you know, a handful of people out there are using what's commonly referred to as dynamic range meters. But that's not really a processing tool. It's a meter. It's kind of like looking at a tuner. It doesn't actually do anything to your sounds. It just tells you what's happening there. But there is the expander, and that I think should be a tool that's part of that conversation, which is why we're talking about it here today. As always, all of our tutorials come to you by way of requests and feedback from our community. So if you've got requests, let us know, folks. We'd love to hear from you. All right, so we're going to look at two different sounds. But before we do, again, we're just going to revisit what compression is. Okay, now the super simplistic definition or explanation or description of compression is automated volume reduction. That's it. That's all it does. It automates several different parameters, usually, especially nowadays with plugins. There's so many parameters involved. It automates the change in settings across all of these parameters to make smooth volume changes in your music, okay? And you dial in all those parameters before you ever hit play. And as your music's playing through, you know, it takes care of it for you. You never have to turn a knob. It's pretty nice. Now, how that works is it's going to take the loudest element in an audio file, and it's going to reduce it by a certain amount. Okay, and you're going to choose those parameters, you know, how loud before the compressor kicks in, and how much does it reduce by, and how quickly does that happen, and how long does it hold that volume reduction for, that type of thing. Okay, now an expander does the exact opposite. Okay, now think about that for just a second. The super simplified description of what a compressor does is automated volume reduction. Okay, so we can easily say that since an expander is the exact opposite of a compressor, it's an automated volume increaser. Okay, so it will take the loudest elements above a threshold or in an audio file and make them louder. Okay, now there are a lot of people that start to get confused when they hear these two things. They're like, oh, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. They do basically the same thing. You know, you're automating your volume up or down. It doesn't really matter what, because when I use a compressor, it makes everything louder. Well, you know, if you're adding gain back, sure, it can make things, the perceived loudness to be much greater. But let's take a look at exactly what's happening there. When you set up your compressor, you set up a threshold, and let's say it's negative 20 dB. Anything above that threshold is going to be reduced in volume. Okay, now if you were to add gain back, let's say you reduced your overall volume by 5 decibels, and the meter in your compressor is telling you that. It's not rocket science. It's nothing too difficult to figure out. So when you add that 5 decibels back, those loudest elements sound just like they did before. But everything sounds louder and bigger because all of those lesser heard elements are now 5 decibels louder. Okay, so what you've done actually is you've increased the floor of the volume floor, or the you've lessened the dynamic range. Now, an expander actually would, in essence, increase the dynamic range. Okay. But again, you're only increasing the volume of the things above a threshold in an expander. And that means that those lesser heard elements, those quieter elements, are never increased in volume unless you're adding gain. And, more often than not, you're really not going to use that gain slider to make things louder in an expander. Okay, that's what the other parameters are there for. But you might back off the gain a little bit to avoid some distortion. Okay, and actually that word distortion is probably a pretty good segue into the meat of this lesson. So let's go ahead and dive in. We've grabbed 2 different sounds here. One is a snare. Okay, it's a funky little digital something. It's crunchy. It's probably good for tech house or something, some minimal kind of techno type thing. And then the other one is just some synthesized gospel ensemble. All right, so nothing to write home about on either sound, but both of them do have one thing that they share, and that is that they're not so impressive right out the gates. All right, so let's just take a look at the snare first. We're just going to solo this and remind you what it sounds like first. All right, now what we're going to do is go into our dynamics folder here and pull out the expander. And the very first thing you want to do, the very first thing, is turn off auto gain. Okay, that's my personal thing. There are factory presets that you can use, and you can use the auto gain feature, but you don't actually have control over that. And it's assuming what you want. And that may not always be the case. The assumption may not be correct. So I automatically just turn off auto gain on anything, on any plugin that it's on. And I think that's a pretty wise maneuver. And here's why with the expander. We'll leave this on. We'll play our sound back, and I'll turn this on, and you judge for yourself if you notice a big difference. So here's our sound. We turn this on. All right, it's a little bit louder, but now listen to this. Okay, so you can hear a greater impact. Even if you do go back and use a feature like auto gain in one of these plugins, it's a good idea to know exactly what's happening with the sound and the settings that you're that you're programming. What kind of effect do they have on the sound? That's a fair question to ask, and you should know. All right, so the next thing we do is we set our threshold. Okay, now remember with the expander, this is a genuine expander. In other words, it's an upward expansion tool, not a downward expansion tool, and those do exist. They increase or expand the volume of everything below the threshold. But again, now you're starting to traipse into the realm of a compressor. So traditionally speaking, an expander, everything above the threshold line here is going to be expanded. So everything above negative 20 dB. If we look at our meter here, we can see that, well, yeah, the large majority of everything is above 20 dB here. So what we don't want to do is get too far down here where we start getting the noise and stuff. Okay, it gets really distorted and funky, and let's listen to that. Okay, so there is a difference here. So let's back this up, and we'll just run through our workflow. Okay, first you set your threshold, and then typically speaking, you're going to set your ratio in your knee next. Okay, for something like this, you're probably going to want to use a peak versus the RMS, or root mean square algorithm, okay, because it's going to look at your audio in real time and assess it peak for peak, versus RMS, which is basically an averaging algorithm, and it's not going to produce the best results for this. Okay, typically speaking, other than automated volume ducking, you really want to use an RMS for a compressor. Okay, so again, this is dealing with the peaks, not the valleys. So your attack might be pretty darn quick here. Your release, it's going to depend upon the sound. Obviously, it can be a lot shorter for shorter sounds. But anything, like the choir, for instance, when we look at that in a bit, we'll have a higher release than the snare. The ratio on a compressor, you're probably used to it moving from left to right, right being the most extreme and left being the most subtle, or nothing at all. But it's the opposite with an expander. Again, it's doing the exact opposite function of a compressor. The knee, however, works exactly the same. Okay, lowest is quickest, highest is longest, and it affects the curve of your the rate at which the compression is being applied and removed. Okay. The other thing to be aware of on a lot of expanders, and in Logic Pro, this actually is hidden in the advanced features. You just click on this little disclosure triangle here, and that is that there is kind of this built-in limiter in a lot of these, and it handles this process through clip distortion. Okay, and by default, a lot of these are actually turned on. And we're going to show you why here in a bit, but we're going to turn it off, again, just so you can get the truest sense of exactly what's happening here. Okay, so again, our sound without any processing applied. And now with the expander on, okay, we are going to bring our threshold down a bit, and we're going to take our ratio down, which is going to make our sound louder. Starting to sound pretty darn good there, but as you may look over here, you'll notice that all the meters are way off the charts. So now something's really wrong. We don't want to keep turning down the volume of our track while we're turning up the perceived loudness through the expander, and how do we find the balance? And this is why auto gain is typically on by default, and why output clip distortion is on by default. Okay, so we're actually going to put this back on soft, and we'll watch this drop down dramatically, but it's still going to be quite loud. Okay, we'll go ahead and toggle this off completely, bypass the effect. Very big difference, right? Look at our volume. Look at our volume here. We'll reset that. We'll play the sound. Negative 1.9 decibels. We'll reset that again. We'll turn on our expander and watch the volume meter again. It's the same. Okay, it's actually coming up just a little bit quieter on the volume meter, but ironically, strangely enough, it's a lot louder sounding, and that's why we refer to this process as a perceived loudness change. Okay, so again, with it off, and with it on. Okay, so a few things are happening here. We're kind of reclaiming a bit of that transient that may not have been as punchy as it could have been. And it's also going to give us a little bit more to grab onto from a mixing standpoint. Okay, so this sound is obviously going to stand out more in the mix, but it may actually help the sound cut through the mix as well with that transient boost there. Okay, so that's one use. Now another use you might have is with a collection of sounds in a single audio file, like singing. Okay, so that's why I grabbed this gospel ensemble. Again, it's a synthesized thing. It's just a stock sound preset, so it's nothing special. But we're going to see exactly how an expander can affect a sound like this. So while that's playing through, I will load up my expander. All right, first thing I'm going to do is turn off my gain, and just for the essence of keeping this as quick as possible, we'll leave the output clip on, and we're going to start with our threshold up here, and we're going to listen to it as it builds. And I'm just making a couple guesses here with the release and the attack, and here we go. Okay, so there is something starting to happen, and hopefully you're wearing headphones, as you should with all of our tutorials, so you can get the most out of them. There's some distortion starting to happen, and this is a pretty common mistake when moving from compression to expansion. Okay, again, with the compressor, when you're increasing the perceived loudness so much, what you're really trying to do is increase the amount of detail that's heard. Those lesser heard and more subtle elements in that audio file are what you're trying to expose. And you're also trying to kind of wrangle in those really those loudest parts. But overall, the majority of people are using compression to bring out those lesser heard elements. Now, oftentimes when you're applying an expander to something, however, you're wanting to avoid accenting those lesser heard elements, attenuate them if possible even, or avoid them completely. And that's why a lot of people will use a tool like an expander for getting rid of background noise or line hum or these annoying elements but they're almost like an essence. They're just kind of persistent throughout an entire recording or something, and an expander can actually deal with some of those. But what we're experiencing here with the gospel ensemble is we're starting to get down in that threshold, and we're increasing the loudness now of some of those aspects of a synthesized choir that you're just not ever really going to like, which may require you to actually reduce the amount of gain. Okay. Now, that might seem a little counterintuitive, this being an expander and us making things louder and all. But if you go back to your early days of using a compressor, you probably felt that was a bit counterintuitive as well, because it's a volume reduction tool and you're making things louder with it. So deal with it. All right, so trust in the process, and we're just going to continue on. Okay, let's do a little A-B comparison. We'll go ahead and we'll toggle this off and listen to what it sounded like originally. Halfway through, I'll toggle it on. Here we go. Okay, so there is a little bit more distortion happening in there, and if I was to spend just maybe half a minute more on this process, I would dial it in and get rid of that completely. But I think that probably covers enough ground for this lesson. I don't want to keep you here all day. So again, just to recover the ground that we've covered today, expander is the exact opposite of a compressor. It increases the dynamic range where a compressor decreases the dynamic range. This type of expander specifically is called a genuine expander, or an upward expansion tool, not to be confused with a downward expansion tool, which actually increases the volume or perceived loudness of things below the threshold. Okay, so again, compressor, reduce volume, expander, increase volume, and that is everything above the threshold. And that's pretty much all you need to know about this bad boy. Use it on drums, use it on vocals, use it in your sound design sessions where you're free to experiment a little bit more freely, I guess. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. As always, we appreciate the support. Hope you can put this to use in your very next project. Hope it cleared up a bunch of questions for you too. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Cheers.